this idea that somehow because the United States is trampling diplomatic norms when it comes to Greenland, that somehow gives Putin a free hand is nonsensical. I mean, there are Russian troops on Ukrainian territory right now, specifically because Russia does not respect international law. And the idea that Putin would use as a pretext anything that Trump is doing is kind of farcical. I mean, Putin was going to continue to do what Putin has done for his entire life, which is be a bloodthirsty thug.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we're going to focus on the US, we're going to focus on Russia, Ukraine, Iran. There's so much happening in the world. So today I've got White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics, Phil Wegmann, on the show. And just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on the Trump Report YouTube channel, or you can stream us as a podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Phil, thank you so much for joining the show again.
Thank you for having me.
Good to get your expertise because you've obviously got your ear to the ground when it comes to everything happening in DC and even outside of it. So I want to get your thoughts on what's happening with Trump and Russia, Ukraine. Now, Trump and Putin, they've spoken. The US president said that the Russian dictator has agreed to pause strikes on Ukrainian cities' energy infrastructure for 1 week due to this extreme cold, but no wider ceasefire was confirmed. This comes after the fact that Russia had been targeting civilians through attacks on apartments, energy facilities, a passenger train. But while this is still a watch and wait situation, because of course we don't really know if Putin will actually respect this 1 week pause, Trump was actually blasted on X for this. So a former UK soldier and Ukrainian Marine, Sean Pinner, he wrote this. He said, "Personally, this is one of the most sickening and disjointed updates I've seen Trump make. To think that Trump's word carries any weight with Putin would be comical if people weren't being killed every day. A 1 week pause will only give Russia time to stockpile, something that they've been doing anyway. It serves no practical purpose beyond a PR stunt. One Putin has all but suggested himself. Meanwhile, we're told there's nearly an economic recovery plan, nearly a security plan, and still no solution to the biggest issue of all, territory." That in conjunction with the Ukrainian journalist who basically said the exact same thing about stockpile and then said Trump will be yelling about how desperately Putin wants peace. Just look at the grand gesture he made for me. So, I mean, he's been accused of thinking this up on the fly, but what are your thoughts on this, Phil?
Well, if this ceasefire for a week lasts, it's a bit of comfort for those on the ground in Ukraine who have had to deal with constant shelling during this land war for the last 4 years now. Obviously, it's so little in comparison to what they actually want. They want an end to that war. And it's not some magnanimous gesture by Putin. How many people in Ukraine currently are homeless and fighting in the cold because their own homes and apartment buildings have been shelled? But it is a sign of potential momentum. We had this trilateral meeting a couple of weeks ago. There's hopes that perhaps this small sign of goodwill could grease the skids towards getting to something bigger. The frustration is understandable, though, at the same time, because how many times have we gone through this entire song and dance where Putin seems to show a bit of willingness to negotiate, but then at the end of the day, he tries to achieve through diplomacy what he was unable to do through strength of arms, which is get territory away from Ukraine. He's asking for the Donbass, and obviously the Ukrainians are saying, well, come and take it. You haven't gotten it already. But this is the definition of a wait and see moment because there's a line in the sand, which is, all right, Russia, don't attack Ukraine for a week. Show some type of humanity and goodwill, and we'll see if they can rise to that very low bar.
And then, of course, it brings into this wider question, if Trump's able to stop Putin from striking Ukrainian energy, then why can't he use this power or this friendship that they have to force him to end the war in general? But I want to get your thoughts on conversations surrounding this, on how the US can help. So, of course, Lindsey Graham's Senate sanction bill hasn't hit the Senate floor yet. It seems to be tabled for right now. But then there's a little bit of commentary online about this House through Strength Against Russia Act that now seems to be stalled with no hearings or vote. It triggered some backlash from bipartisan sponsors like Brian Fitzpatrick and pro-Ukraine lawmakers. This bill would essentially impose mandatory sanctions on Russia's leaders, banks, energy oligarchs, defense sectors, foreign enablers. But why do you think this has been stalled? And why do you think Trump isn't using this, tool to be able to bankrupt Putin?
Well, it's sanctions on sanctions on sanctions at this point. I would defer to the experts when it comes to what actual effect this legislation would have. But my suspicion is that the reason why Trump hasn't, demanded this, and make no mistake, if he asked lawmakers to put this on his desk, it would happen, today or tomorrow. It would move that quickly in a Congress controlled by Republicans in both the House and the Senate. But my suspicion is that the reason why he's not moving forward with additional sanctions thus far is because he's still trying to get Russia to the negotiation table, to actually keep them there, to find some sort of diplomatic off-ramp here. Look, I think that there is a lot of criticism of the Trump administration, and that is warranted, on numerous fronts. But in comparison to what we saw for the last 4 years of the Biden administration, there's at least some type of traction when it comes to talks. And what we've seen thus far is if there's going to be a military solution here, which is something that the West and Ukraine don't want, then it's going to be a military solution where, frankly, Russia wins. They continue to pour more troops into the meat grinder. Putin has already made clear that he has no better nature when it comes to sacrificing that much humanity. And so the hope is that through diplomacy, this thing can eventually come to an end. And again, my suspicion with holding back sanctions is not that, Trump has some soft spot for Putin, who he has become increasingly frustrated with, even though occasionally, he says kind things about him. My suspicion is that he's holding that in reserve.
Well, President Zelenskyy, he was speaking to reporters in Kyiv on Thursday night. He said a few things about what really the updates are on these negotiations. The first thing he said that security guarantees should be split between the coalition of the willing, the EU and the US, but Ukraine has no plans to hand over Donbass, and they won't do it without a fight. So he also responded to Putin's invitation to Moscow. He said, well, I publicly invite Putin to come to Kyiv if he dares. And then the other thing he spoke about is this idea from the US to annex Greenland. He said, in my view, the Greenland story is a very specific case that could be used tomorrow to take territories from us, and recognize that this must be viewed from that angle as well. And when several dozen troops are sent to support Denmark, what does that mean? What signal does that send? So I wonder, Phil, if you consider that a dig to Trump, calling him out over this, dangerous attempt to annex Greenland. Of course, at one point he said, look, I'm not ruling out military action, but that never went through. He then pulled back on tariff threats as well. But the idea of taking territory that isn't yours, of course, mirrors what Putin did to Ukraine. Do you think that that's kind of what Zelenskyy is saying?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what this ongoing negotiation between the U.S. and the Danes actually leads to. The United States has long wanted Greenland. In fact, we had Greenland after the Second World War, but then through a series of negotiations, which were actually quite generous to the United States, we turned it back to Denmark. One of the things that's been surprising about this entire narrative is that while the United States and Donald Trump has said that we need to acquire the island, the treaties going back to the Cold War give the United States wide latitude to do kind of whatever we want on that island, from building military bases, taking control of ports, you name it. We haven't seen that from this administration yet. And so the question is, does the United States just want to raise the flag over Greenland and acquire more territory to pad Donald Trump's legacy? Or is, it not a pretext, and there's actually some seriousness there that the United States wants to do more to defend Greenland and have more of a presence in the Arctic against Chinese and Russian aggression. All of that said, I think it's incredibly bold for Zelenskyy to sort of throw that elbow there. First, because we've seen how antagonism against the Trump administration has ended up for him previously. It led to a pause in weapons during the first year of the second Trump administration, and that was not advantageous to Ukraine at all. I mean, frankly, the United States is the single guarantor of Ukraine. I mean, they have shown heroism on the battlefield, but make no mistake, the generosity of the American people is the reason why they are still in that war. But this idea that somehow because the United States is trampling diplomatic norms when it comes to Greenland, that somehow gives Putin a free hand is nonsensical. I mean, there are Russian troops on Ukrainian territory right now, specifically because Russia does not respect international law. And the idea that Putin would use as a pretext anything that Trump is doing is kind of farcical. I mean, Putin was going to continue to do what Putin has done for his entire life, which is be a bloodthirsty thug. I don't think that he's looking to Washington D.C. for stage cues.
Of course, the conversation of annexing Greenland and it being under the US has kind of, I guess, dropped off the radar right now, Phil. But do you see the US requesting, and I'm not even quite sure if they need to request it, but do you see them asking for a bigger military presence in Greenland at the very least?
That was what was expected coming out of these negotiations that happened at the World Economic Forum. Donald Trump hasn't been totally clear about what that means. But yeah, the expectation is that if the United States is going to have a bigger footprint or be allowed to have a bigger footprint, that they would actually follow through, that there would be an expansion there on the island. And, again, there's nothing to stop the White House from doing that already today, right now. We could send more troops to Greenland if we really wanted to tomorrow. So, we'll have to see what this new agreement actually entails.
Let's move on to the US and Iran. US Armada and the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group are heading towards Iran after entering the Indian Ocean on Monday. So US and Iran negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and their ballistic missile production seems to be making no progress in terms of diplomatic talks in the last few days. Trump has said that he would prefer not to strike Iran, but reports today indicating that Trump's considering the possibility of military action that could include targeting strikes on Iranian leaders or key regime and security figures. So do you see a world in which Trump actually does attempt to take out Ali Khamenei and his leaders in the regime?
He did it with Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. I think if we just rewind the clock a little bit, the other week, Donald Trump was telling protesters in the streets in Iran that the United States would help them. And he was encouraging them to seize Iranian institutions. That help did not materialize as quickly as they would have liked. And according to some human rights analysts, there have been something like 30,000 or more deaths of these protesters who, were on the streets heroically, protesting against that regime. I think one of the reasons why we didn't see military action previously is because there wasn't a carrier strike group. The emphasis had been shifted to Venezuela, to our own neck of the woods. Now that strike group is there, and so not just this line in the sand, but also this threat is much more real to the Iranians. We'll see if they're willing to actually have negotiations with Trump, or they're going to continue to thumb their nose at him. But I think that the fact that we're talking about the United States not having a free hand in the Middle East, as we've been focused more on our hemisphere, sort of underscores this argument, whether you agree with it or not, from the current administration, which is that the United States can't be everywhere all at once. We can't, police the North and South America, while also guaranteeing, European security, and then also, confronting a rising China and Russia while securing the Middle East as well. So there's a limit to what you can actually do with a finite number of material and men.
And there's a few images that have come out in the last few days, or reports from locals who have broken through this communication restriction inside Iran that seem to be asking for help from Donald Trump. So I wonder if Iranians want US military intervention.
Yeah, judging from some of the images of protesters changing the names of streets to, Donald Trump Avenue, to reading some of the signs where they actually implore him directly to intervene on their behalf. It seems that there are some who want a larger U.S. presence there. I mean, obviously the regime does not, because they've seen a very recent history of the United States acting unilaterally and decisively, striking Maduro, and not just striking the Maduro regime and sending him to prison in the United States, but really humiliating the Cubans, the Chinese, the Russians. The Cuban security forces that were protecting Maduro were no match for the United States. Chinese and Russian, anti-air systems were, just laughably inept at stopping the U.S. Air Force. It is clear at this moment, even as Donald Trump, has said for a decade that he doesn't want to start new wars, that he wants to show restraint, that America first requires America not to be everywhere. The United States remains the world's hegemon. We can do things that other world powers cannot. And so I think that, the appetite from this current White House is they want decisive action, but limited action. They don't want another land war. They don't want another regime change war thousands of miles from home. But, Donald Trump, he drew that line in the sand, not unlike Barack Obama's red line. And now he has to back it up because they continue to kill protesters.
And on that note, if the US does target senior Iranian figures, a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader has warned that Iran will retaliate by striking Israel. So if that happens, could the US find itself in a wider Middle East war?
That's the fear, and that was the fear going into these strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities. Those strikes were so decisive, and Iran was so completely humiliated that they couldn't really launch much of a response. What was interesting about those attacks is that rather than leading to a larger war, it showed the Iranian regime how existential their situation was. Somehow Donald Trump was able to, cut off the rung of the escalatory ladder, and it didn't lead to a wider conflict. In fact, it stopped it. So we'll see if a similar play can be done again. But that's the thing, when you put despots on the back heel, when you put them, into a corner, they don't have many options other than to lash out. And so the White House has presented Iran with, two options: negotiate or, potentially face another strike.
On the domestic front, Phil, reports this week have been circulating that Donald Trump may be looking to replace Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem after all this backlash after the Minnesota ICE raids and subsequent deaths. So you've got your ear to the ground in DC. What are you hearing on whether this will happen, if there's a replacement, or even if Trump is willing to do that, because it would essentially be a bit of an admission of guilt, a bit of admission of wrongdoing?
Yeah, Donald Trump has shown a hesitation to tell anyone you're fired this time around. The first Trump administration was defined by a lot of infighting and a lot of firings, frankly. A lot of people that started in that administration didn't make it to the end. This time around, he wants to keep the team intact for, efficiency's sake, but also, like you mentioned a second ago, he doesn't want to give Democrats a win. My sources, they think that Kristi Noem's time as DHS secretary is limited, but they don't see the time frame as, her being given the boot sometime before April or May of this year, but maybe, towards the end of the year or perhaps before the midterm elections. If she goes, that immediately sets up another confirmation fight where Trump has to get another nominee through the Senate. That probably wouldn't be too difficult for him in the grand scheme of things, but it's a distraction from what he wants to press on the home front, which is his efforts to make life for the everyday American more affordable. That said, while Kristi Noem seems to be safe in her job for now, she wasn't called on to speak in yesterday's cabinet meeting. That's not nothing. And, we can report here at Real Clear Politics that there's at least 3 serious potential contenders for this role. Former Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, former Utah Representative Jason Chaffetz, and also EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. But I think that what might be most likely is we see Tom Homan in Minneapolis calming the situation down, working with Democrats to try and find a solution. That's a big, almost impossible if. But if he's able to bring calm to that chaos and continue deportation operations in Minnesota without too much controversy, then perhaps Tom Homan, the border czar, would be in pole position to replace Kristi Noem as the next Homeland Security Administrator.
Trump versus Canada has been big in the headlines as of late, and it further intensified this week, Phil, after he threatened Canada over a jet certification dispute, accusing Ottawa of blocking US-made Gulfstream aircraft to protect Bombardier. He's warning he'll retaliate by decertifying Canadian planes and then slapping a 50% tariff on aircraft sold into the US. Can you walk me through this conflict between the two countries right now?
Yeah, this is big news if you owned a Gulfstream, right? So, if you are listening on your private jet as you zip around the United States, this might be of interest to you. This one is strange, right? We're talking about a number of incredibly expensive aircraft generally that are used as PJs. And this seems to be a bit of tit for tat. The Canadians have not certified our aircraft. And so Donald Trump says, we're not going to certify yours. This is the sort of thing that normally would be dealt with peer to peer with diplomats. I don't know if this would even rise to the level of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, but instead, Donald Trump, he intends to elevate it. He wants those Gulfstreams to be certified in Canada. And if the Canadians don't fold on this one, then it seems that it will be that much more difficult for the billionaire class to buy Canadian private jets here in the United States. It is hardball. It's classic Donald Trump. But the application here is strange because at a moment when he needs to tell his supporters ahead of the midterms that he continues to work hard to get the price of groceries down, to make mortgages more affordable, he's pivoting to talking about certification of private jets. It's a bit odd.
Phil Wegmann, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you, Maddie.